Hello and welcome into another episode of the My Two Bits Gator Football Podcast. As always, I am one of your hosts, Ben, and joined as always by my other host, Mr. Randy. How we doing tonight, Randy?
B, what's going on, my man? All is well in the land. Had a nice hot day here in Gaines, Vegas, 92 degrees. Partly cloudy right now, hovering in the high 80s, but overall, good.
Yes, as always, with the weather forecast up in Gainesville for all those who would like to know how it is in Florida. And as it is always hot this time of year, as it is down in South Florida for me this evening as well. So, yes, it is that time of year where the heat has set in and shall not leave for quite some time. So, we better get used to it, right? So, without further ado, let's talk about tonight's episode and what we're going to get into. We are a week delayed from our normal 3-week cadence in the off season here. And the reason for that is we had to do a little pivot on what we wanted to talk about tonight and what we wanted to get into. We were planning on doing something and kind of looking at some player spotlights and kind of getting into that. We're still going to bring you that pod and kind of look at that probably for our next episode. But we had this release a couple weeks ago here of what's going on with these recent changes to the whole NIL situation yet again. Shocker, right? But we felt like we really wanted to delve into this, kind of take a look at some of these changes and what the implications of them are. And then, of course, we also have this development with the whole Rashada situation as well. So we really wanted to dive into this and kind of talk about what we think it means for college football as a whole, Florida, of course, and how it relates to the program, how it relates to some specific things with Napier and everything else. So we decided to kind of pivot, take that on. And as a result, we were a little delayed in kind of looking into that and doing some research on it. So for this episode, we are going to do an analysis of the recent NIL changes, or at least proposed changes, I suppose I should say. They're not final, and the implications that they might bring. I think from looking at this, it's in all likelihood going to be more or less the changes that we'll see. We'll discuss that, but that's what we're going to get into for this episode. And to that end, we will start with our intro as always, with our mission, our vision, and our agenda for this pod. So our mission, as always, is to provide factual analysis of all things Florida Gator football. Our vision is to have unfiltered conversation around the product on the field, as well as recruiting and overall coaching decisions. Our analysis will always be based on review of film, and while we will express opinion, that opinion should always be based in some form of fact. We will also evaluate strategy and tactics and discuss our observation of player personnel and decisions on the field, as well as on-field execution. So for this particular pod, we are going to focus, as I said, more around NIL changes, and we will review the recent NCAA decision to change their policy on NIL via the pending court case, of course. So it's, again, not final, and it does have to be approved by a judge, which we will talk about. But we're going to take a look at that and what that potentially means and what the ramifications of that are. We'll talk about what it is and kind of why it happened, or at least why it potentially happened, I guess I should say. We will then review the role of the current NIL collectives under the new proposed rules and how they are potentially going to change, why they're still important, why they still matter going forward. We will then have a discussion around the Rashada lawsuit and what that looks like and kind of why maybe it came about and where we go from here with it. And then we'll have a little discussion to close this out around the implications of that lawsuit as it relates to the rivalry with Georgia. So we felt like that was an interesting little conversation to have now that Rashada, of course, plays for Georgia or is transferred to that team. I don't know how much he's going to play, but that's another conversation. So we'll kind of take a look at that and where all this fans out. There were some interesting reports that came out at first about Kirby's involvement with that a little bit, and I think that was maybe blown out of proportion a little bit, and we'll discuss that a little bit and go from there. So with that, let's get things started and kind of look at this whole change to the NIL policy. Again, not official yet, but what has been proposed by the NCAA in their case with the House here, and what they're proposing to do differently. So let's have a discussion of that policy proposal. And I'll let you get us started there, Randy. Let's kind of break that down and look at that as what is being proposed and what's being looked at and where we go from here. What are we talking about? Break it down for us.
First of all, loaded subject. Like,
yeah, just
I'm not
a little bit.
Get more. When you talk about, I hear the term loaded and think about something that's super packed. I think, a cigar and a loaded baked potato. But either way, last Thursday, the landscape of NIL, well, outside of NIL, the landscape of paying college players just changed forever, right? And so a couple things that we're going to go over is the agreement as part of the class action lawsuit. The main one that was referenced was House versus NCAA, the NCAA. It must be approved by a federal judge overseeing the case, right? Based off what we've been told or what we've read, this could be months away. It could be 3, 4, 5, 6 months, whatever the number. Payments can start as early as fall 2025. But as we know with different things, dealing with court system, dealing with rulings, especially the NCAA, who knows how long it could take. If it goes with the construction of a house, as I've been told by many, many people, it takes twice as long and costs twice as much. Okay.
But wait, the wheels of justice turn quickly, right?
Oh, yeah, exactly. if only, my friend, if only. The proposed settlement has two parts. And so that's where a little bit where we're going to break down right now. The first part is it's going to distribute somewhere in the vicinity of $2.75 billion to athletes who competed before July 2021. And the reason why July 2021 is a significant date is because that's when the NCAA first allowed athletes to earn money from their name, their image, and their likeness rights. So that's when a part of Pandora's box was opened up, right?
Yep.
And so you have the objective here that monies that could have been made in, well, damages from NIL, video games, NCAA college football. Does anybody remember that? Okay. Just wondering.
You're about to remember it come July of 2025. Thank you very much. Or 2024, excuse me. Thank you very much.
Bingo. Share of TV revenue. That's something that we've talked about forever and ever and ever more. Amen. And then you have the potential payback dating to somewhere around 2016, right? Yep. You have some, again, who's going to get paid, how they're going to get paid, why they're going to get paid. Disproportionately, the majority of those funds are going to go towards college football and more than likely men's basketball. And a little bit of that may be going to women's basketball. Now,
in all likelihood, that's still undecided, right?
100%. It is. And that's the thing. That's the thing that people need to understand. The ruling, historical landmark. However, here's the thing. It still needs to be overseen by the judge. And as a decision, a final decision is months away. Okay. So the first part, the 2.75 billion based off that period of time, right? The second part, now this is more interesting. This is what a lot more people have called upon for, is it would create a future revenue sharing model in which schools could distribute somewhere around, I've seen 20 million, 21 million, 22 million per year directly to pay athletes. Now, that is what's unique in the sense of the main call for this has been due to the years and years and decades of, hey, look at these TV deals. Look at what the NCAA is profiting. Look at what the schools are profiting. Look what the conferences are profiting. But yet, a football player can't sign a helmet for $200.
Yep.
Yet, we can't give a kid a handout for tuition or whatever, or extracurricular, this, that, and the other, because it's the form of illegal compensation and whatever the case might be. So the agreement calls for the NCAA and the conferences to pay $2.77 billion, whatever the number, right, over the next 10 years to more than 14,000 former and current college athletes who say now, obviously, the defunct rules, right, prevented them from earning money from endorsements, all the NIL deal dating back to 2016. So very, very unique ruling here. And again, it's not finalized, but the main 2 points, as they're mentioned, is the ruling of the 2.7 billion and change. And then the second is the model moving forward for the rev sharing for college athletes. And again, the rev sharing is going to come from the NCAA and schools, or the back pay is going to come from the NCAA. There's some information in the documents that show that the NCAA does have an operating fund. So some of the monies will come from there. Also, it will come from an insurance backing for some of the dollars. But then again, some of the schools are on the hook for
Yep.
some of that back pay as well.
Yep. That's correct. And
Right.
then the money going forward is going to come from the schools.
Exactly. So that's going to be very
So
interesting how that's going to set up.
if you're confused, join the club.
100%. 100%.
So, as we've discussed before, and this I think is what the important point is, and I think also a really key point in this.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry if you weren't finished yet, but I'll just take a minute here.
That's the gist of it. No.
Okay. All right. Cool. So I think the important thing is going forward here, and we'll focus, because I think the back pay thing is important, but I think you did a good job of summing that up. The amount is clear. How it gets paid is not clear. And I think that's going to be an absolute cluster, quite frankly, in how that gets doled out. And I think that could make for just an absolute treasure trove of lawsuits. But fortunately, that's up to the NCAA to figure out, and they're going to have to deal with that mess. So good luck. However, going forward, to your point, the schools, at least the Power 5 schools, are going to be on the hook for what they've figured out to be the average, an average of 20. It's either 20 or 25%. I can't remember which. I think it's 20% of their revenue dollars generated, right, for their athletic programs as a whole, which comes to an amount of 21 actually million. A lot of articles said 20, but it's actually 21 million annually. And that comes from all sources, as you said, including TV revenue dollars. And that's from every Power 5 school, which is interesting because when you look at schools like the SEC, especially with their new contract coming from ESPN, it's not 21 million is not 20% in a lot of cases. So that's very interesting. What else is interesting is that they're going to be paying this out and it's going to be a basically a capped figure that they're going to be, responsible for. And it's actually 22% of the revenue, which accounts for $21 million. So, the long and the short of it is that's the dollar figure that they're going to be responsible for, but also capped at that they can pay players, because as you said, they can now pay players right directly, which is a very interesting development, right, that they're able to do, that they can actually dole out and do this, even though they're still not set up technically as employees, which is quite confusing because they're going to be paying them directly, but yet they're not employees, at least not yet. That could potentially change. I feel
W-2 status.
Yeah, exactly. But as of yet, they are not technically employees. Again, I see that as potentially changing, but as of today or tomorrow or whatever, it has not. So very, very interesting development in that regard, and something that we have said is going to be very beneficial for Florida. Why is it beneficial for Florida? Let's talk about that for a minute. The reason it's beneficial for Florida is, once again, that 22% is an average of all Power 5, or now really Power 4. Goodbye, Pac-12. Power 4 schools.
Goodbye.
And because of that, because Florida's in the SEC, which has a higher TV revenue dollar stream, that will be on the lower end. It will not probably represent, in all likelihood, I don't know the exact number for Florida, but I would venture to say very confidently that it is not 22% of our revenue dollars. It is less than that, right, for that 21 million. So it will be easy for Florida to come up with that money. It will not be a strain on the program. It will not take dollars from somewhere else, right, and have them have to pull it in order to allocate these dollars. Now, what is still not known about this 21 million is how does it get allocated, right? Title IX comes into play, meaning how does it get allocated to men's and women's sports, right? Revenue sharing in general between the sports, right? Does it have to get allocated evenly between all sports, or can it be allocated to the more revenue generating sports? These things have not been worked out yet. I don't have those answers. I'm not going to speculate on those answers right now. At the end of the day, if it doesn't mostly go to football, I'll be shocked. But again, not going to speculate, not going to say what I think happens, because that just is what it is. But at the end of the day, that's where the collective thing comes into play, and we'll get to that in a minute. What it comes down to, though, is that there is money now that can go directly to players from the university. And as we have talked about before, collectives were previously responsible for any pay-for-play deals, which again were supposed to be through sponsorships and endorsement deals and everything else. However, they were handled by the collectives and handled by money that came from boosters, not from the university. This opens a different door for that revenue, and that's key and crucial and really important because it doesn't put all of the onus on the roster building funding to come from boosters, because that was a big issue for Florida in particular, right? We've talked about this in our previous NIL coverage, right? In our previous pod, episode 21, if you'd like to go back and listen to that, about how we discussed our plight, if you will, with the lack of funding that we had in a lot of cases for some of this stuff, because it all had to come from boosters. Guess what? That's no longer the case. And that's huge news in a good way for UF. So that in and of itself is a big deal. The other element of this, however, that we haven't gotten into is they did make some rules in terms of the number of scholarships you can have. They increased the number of scholarships for most sports, but not necessarily for football, maybe a few, but that's still a little up in the air. However, one of the things that they talked about, at least preliminarily, taking away was the walk-ons. They said no more walk-ons for football. Well, the initial reaction from that, from more teams than just Florida, was, whoa, 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 whoa. You can't do that, right? Because we depend on having our walk-ons on this team. It's very important. And it's a big deal, especially for Florida and Napier, because Napier has built his model around having 50 some odd walk-ons on the team to kind of build up like a farm system. It's certainly nothing else, a practice squad, but we've seen multiple different walk-ons actually get promoted. Can we say Khalil Jackson? How about who's the other wide receiver? Name just went out of my head. Help me out, please. Sperto, thank you. Who very well may be a scholarship player this year. And by the way, where would Cormani McLean be right now if we did not have a walk-on status? Because would he be a Gator? I don't even know at this point. So this goes to the point that we're making of how Napier leverages walk-ons in various different situations to try to help build his roster, build, again, his farm system. Now, does that mean all 50 of those walk-ons are going to get scholarships in the long run? Of course not. But he uses it as a building ground, again, a practice squad. This is his model. So if we eliminate walk-ons completely, oh, that's a huge blow to what Napier's trying to do here. Now, for what it's worth, I'm not sure that that ends up happening. That was just the initial proposal. And again, it was met with a lot of pushback. So I'm not sure that that's what ends up happening, but it's something to really consider in looking at all this. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So those would be my thoughts on this and how it looks and how it's working. And again, it's all somewhat theoretical because the judge hasn't signed off on it yet, nor will she for some time. However, I think it's important to keep that in mind in going forward, that it's probably going to look something like this in the long run. It's just not necessarily going to look exactly like what's been proposed, right? But it's probably going to be something in this nature. Any other thoughts from you on what this policy looks like before we move on?
Yeah, I think it's really tough because, and agree, the judge is going to come back. There's going to be some changes. Completely agree that this is not, this first iteration is not going to be the end all be all. The interesting thing in some of the other research that we went over, B, is interestingly enough, schools in the Big 10, the Big 12, like you said, we're looking at the Pac-12 and what's happening there, but the ACC and the SEC would end up bearing the majority, the brunt of that, right? And it looks like it'd be about 300 million a piece over the next 10 years. And so very, very interesting, a large sum. And based off of everything else that we're looking at, it just seems like with the NCAA reserve, the slush fund, whatever you want to call it, plus the insurance and all the other things backing it, the NCAA should be able to pull those dollars. Again, now it's just based off the universities, what they're able to come up with and not. The other thing that's interesting is, and you brought it up, now we're going to directly be able to pay players. But payment comes in different forms. If it's not W-2 employment, then it's contractor employment, contractor being a 1099. So you avoid some of the different taxes such as Social Security tax, FICA tax, and Medicaid. So when you look at things like that, a 1099 is not a direct employee, right? There's different rules that come with a 1099 versus a W-2 compensated employee. And the other interesting thing to note is the NCAA and schools are already lobbying to Congress to pass a federal antitrust exemption for college sports specifically that would protect them from the future lawsuits that could ensue and will ensue over different forms of payment. So very, very critical, not just at this junction now, but as you mentioned, over the next 10 years moving forward.
By the way, as a bonus for those listening, you get a Business 101 law credit for listening to the pod tonight.
There we go. We'll go ahead and sign off on that on the 32nd of February. No, just kidding.
No, but really good point. This antitrust filing that they're doing is to try to avoid further lawsuits because they see them coming, as they should, because they're again opening just a different side of Pandora's box, I think, in regards to this, especially as it relates, as we mentioned, to Title IX. I think potentially, especially on those back payments, I see big issues for future lawsuits. But again, that's the NCAA's problem. I think Florida's not really going to have to mess with that too much. I think the only potential issue there is how they deal out the $21 million. But my hope is that maybe when the judge does rule on this, there will be some guidelines that get formalized around that, in how that can and can't be addressed, though I don't know how much will be there. I also know one other point, the SEC has actually asked Congress for a more formal law around this. So we'll see if or when that actually takes place. Don't know that it will, but if it does, that would probably provide some clarity as to how the universities can or should handle some of these monies, and hopefully that would clear up some of the legality and, potential lawsuits that could come from this. So speaking of lawsuits, let's talk about why this happened. Why did we get here? How did we get here, right? What put us in this place that this proposal was even named? If you recall back to a previous pod that we had, we discussed Charlie Baker actually proposing a $30 million a year, which this is 21, but a $30 million a year stipend, if you will, for players from the universities, right? Including potentially some TV revenue dollars, though that wasn't specifically itemized, but just from the UAA, right? From the schools, university athletic associations to pay players, right? As a set kind of salary capped model, very similar to what we have here. He proposed this back in December, right? And we talked about this as something that he had put on the table, which was very interesting. And here we are with something that is quite similar to that the NCAA has actually gone ahead and said, yes, we're okay with this. We want to go forward with this kind of model, yada, yada, yada. So it's interesting because it's very similar, at least to something that he already proposed for potential review by the committee and everything else. So I think you saw the framework for this already be put in place back in December with his initial proposal. And then you saw this, come to fruition with this, potential resolution. Again, it has to be signed off on. But again, why? Why did this happen in the first place? Well, pretty easy, straightforward answer is the lawsuits, right? We know about the state lawsuits from Tennessee and Virginia. We know about all the player lawsuits, and I'm not talking about Rashada. I'm talking about the Colorado lawsuits and the California lawsuits, right? All these different players suing for sufficient NIL compensation, right? Whether it be at the high school level or at the college level or so on and so forth. There are multiple different lawsuits that are going on. I think another reason that this came about, though, aside from all those lawsuits, is the lack of ability to enforce the current policy, right? We've seen where they tried to enforce it at Tennessee, and then Tennessee and Virginia sued them, as we just talked about. And guess what? The courts sided with Tennessee and Virginia and said, nope, you can't do this. It's not okay. You're not able to enforce this the way you're saying you can. Players can seek NIL compensation any way they'd like, and the NCAA can't do anything about it.
Stuff. Yeah.
Stuff about it. There you go. So keep this family friendly. So at the end of the day, what it comes down to is that whether it was the suits, whether it was the lack of their ability to enforce any of the policy that they had in place, either way, the NCAA was basically a organization in name only at this point, right? They really weren't doing anything. So this puts them back on the map as at least a governing body in terms of being able to set some kind of parameter, right, for what the schools are doing and be able to at least say, okay, this is your policy. Now, again, as it comes to enforcement, I don't know what kind of teeth they'll have. I really don't. That remains to be seen. And I'm not sure that it'll be any. Again, we don't know how that looks. But what I do see is them at least trying to say, okay, these look like more reasonable rules based on the state of NIL and what it looks like and how it's working and what it should work like, right? Which they do make a lot more sense than what the current policy was, I'll tell you that, based on what we've read and seen so far. And I think that makes a heck of a lot more sense. So I'm glad that they've done something that's more logical, that's more fitting for what this policy, at least in theory, should represent. And I think it's a step forward. Is it going to get us all the way there? No, I don't think so. I think there's several other things that probably have to happen, but it's at least a step in the right direction. And I think because of those things, that's why you probably saw this come into play. What are your thoughts on why we saw this change occur?
Great points, B. I couldn't have said it better. When you look at what's interesting to me is I looked at some of the articles behind it, and it stems back from a couple things. Great call out on Baker. And if people don't know this, Mark Emmert, the former president, CEO, face of the NCAA, who was replaced with Charlie Baker. People have to understand the history of Baker. Baker, former two-term Massachusetts governor. A lot of people touted him as someone who's very familiar with finding solutions in complicated situations, right? Throughout his career within healthcare, in general, just government, politics, whatever the case may be. And a lot of people pegged Baker as the face to potentially fix, and I know that is a very tough word, but fix or fixing the NCAA. Right. And so that's really critical because I think when you look at everything else that Charlie Baker was coming into, it's almost like, if you want, I don't know if it's a fair parallel, but almost what Napier came into, right? Looking at the discombobulation, right? The discombobulation of an organization, no direction, lacking this, lacking that. And the other thing that and you mentioned the cases, I'll bring up one in specific. This case was set to go to trial early next year, right? Somewhere around the spring of 25. Because again, it takes time to go through the court system. But Interestingly enough, it was brought about by a former, right, and current college athlete who said the NCAA, and of course the Power Five, improperly barred. So this was part of the clause or part of the suit, the main part. Improperly barred athletes from earning due endorsement money. Very interesting. Now you go, oh, okay, well, sure, Power Five, football, basketball, TV deals. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. But guess what? It came from a swimmer.
Yep.
Right? And I don't mean to poke fun at that or light at that, but in lieu of everything else, and this is the other thing too, and we're not gonna go here because this is just another side of Pandora's box. When you look at equity, what does that mean, right? You mentioned Title IX, B. You mentioned all those other things that come into play. But at the end of the day, you have a former ASU swimmer, right, an Oregon TCU basketball player, basically saying in their suits that athletes are, and this is a key word, entitled to a piece of the billions of dollars that's the NCAA and all of those conferences earn from specific media rights and agreements with the television networks. These student athletes were entitled to a portion of that revenue.
Yep,
that's it.
Exactly.
right? And so when you look at the actions by Baker, by the NCAA, at the end of the day, very similar to what happened in the initial lawsuits from Tennessee, Virginia. The NCAA, I think, with lawsuit after lawsuit, they're like, you know what? Yeah, we're losing. We're just going to lose. When you look at the policies, when you look at the procedures, when you look at the enforcements, when you look at everything else that there is, I think Charlie Baker is sitting back there going, guess what? Any lawsuit that comes forth, how do we combat that? We can't. We have to settle. We have to move in this era of, you know what? Fair compensation will exist. Compensation should exist. We don't know how. That's what we're trying to iron out. But that's the main posture that I think Charlie Baker and the NCAA has to take in order to still preserve the quote unquote NCAA, which, of course, after this landmark is no longer when you look at everything that they stood for since 1906. And so that aside, it's really going to be interesting how the NCAA moves forward with this and the other policies and procedures that come into place, because regarding payment, regarding antitrust laws, regarding the quote unquote equity and the fairness of everything else, we only know. It's not a matter of if, just when other lawsuits come down the pipeline. Hence why the NCAA went ahead and made a motion for the antitrust exemption moving forward.
Yeah, no, I think those are all really good points. I think the biggest thing that I would take away from what you said there is whether it was the lawsuits that, were going after the TV dollars, which now are in play, proposed under this, right? Or the lack of the ability to enforce the rules that they had in play for how players were or weren't able to be compensated under NIL, right? Regardless of TV dollars, that they couldn't enforce. All of that's gone now under this ruling. None of that applies anymore, right? Whether it's TV dollars are in play or their enforcement of their kind of archaic rules are not in play, all that is now taken care of with this potential settlement. And I think that's kind of what's key about this, right? Or the keys about this. So again, assuming that the judge signs off on some version that is similar to this, which again, I believe that she will. Again, it doesn't look exactly like it's proposed. I don't know. That's we can't speculate on that. We don't know exactly what it looks like. Hopefully, honestly, it's a little more well-defined in what she signs off on. And I think, frankly, it might be because she has a lot of experience from what I was reading about dealing with antitrust and NCAA lawsuits. She's presided over many of them. So I think she will probably be very well positioned to make this ruling, right, when it comes that time, which is a good thing because it probably allows for a lot more specificity in these rulings and everything else, or in the final judgment, if you will. But at the end of the day, I think it's going to cover a lot of bases for the NCAA in what they are and aren't allowing, right? And I think hopefully it puts them back in a place where they are setting up rules that make more sense, because the ones that exist right now don't, right? And therefore are hopefully a little more enforceable in terms of maybe enforceable is the wrong word, accountable in a good way, right? That's I think where we need to get to. And again, I'm not opposed to some other legislation from a national level getting involved here, as long as it's not super prohibitive, right? And that's a double-edged sword typically when we get that level of things involved. Often, right? So you got to be careful what you wish for, but I'm not opposed to it in theory anyway. So we'll see what happens there. But anyway, moving on. So next topic on the docket is, let's talk about NIL collectives. So now that we have the schools paying the players, we don't need NIL collectives anymore, right? Wrong. There will still be NIL collectives under this new model, and they are just as important as they were before. Why, you ask? Because we're paying players, right? So what do we need NIL collectives for? To pay players more is the answer. So when you have a salary capped system, what's better than bonuses, right? Then that's really the role of NIL collectives going forward under this system is what else can we do to incentivize players to come, right, and get them to potentially, come here from a financial compensation. Because if Ole Miss has 21 million and Florida has 21 million and Alabama has 21 million and Georgia has 21 million, where's the incentive, right? And in theory, you go back to, well, the incentive is recruiting, right? Well, yeah, we know that's not how it's going to work, right? Because when money's on the table, which, let's be real, it always has been, right? Legally, illegally, whatever the case might be. But now that it's legal, right? Let's focus on that. This is where the collectives come into play, is what other incentives can we offer players? And I'm not saying that's all that matters, and I don't think it is all that matters, for the record, but I think it is still a piece of this in what other incentives can players be offered to, come and participate in, football, baseball, basketball, whatever it might be. I'm not focused solely on football in this conversation, though obviously that's the one that's going to get the most attention, and certainly the most of our attention when it comes to this podcast. But when we look at this, that's what the role is that they're going to play. They're still going to play a huge role in recruitment and, signing of players that come to UF going forward. And the reason why is, like I said, the above and beyond of the 21 million, right? Because that is a fixed number, and how much of it even goes to football, as we said, we don't know. It could be evenly divided, so it might be just a, mediocre share of that number. I don't think that's how it's going to go, but we don't know. Title IX might state that it has to be that way. We're really not sure how that's going to get divided up. So collectives are absolutely going to continue to play a big role. Florida Victoria is still going to continue to play a big role, whether football has 80% of the money or 10, it doesn't matter. Either way, it's going to continue to be a very important thing. How will that change? Well, here's the interesting thing. Because the boosters are now not forced to spend all their money, right, on players. In other words, that is not the sole source of the funds going to players, being Florida Victorious. Now, I foresee a less reluctant booster group in order to, potentially fund some of these collectives going forward, and not just Florida's, for the record. I think that'll be a universal. In addition to that, and possibly most interesting, one of the other aspects of this whole thing, because the universities are directly funding these things, it has been absolutely discussed, and really more than discussed, proposed, that there will be player contracts under this new proposal. So I will quote Yahoo Sports on this, and the author of this article is Ross Dillinger, and he states in his article, at the end of his article, in regards to this whole mess, if you will, that officials are discussing a range of possibilities as it relates to the transfer portal and athlete contracts, including implementing buyout clauses that are often found in coaching contracts. There's a possibility as well, to tie academic performance to contracts. As a part of the settlement, a school is expected to have the ability to purchase a player's exclusive NIL rights, a significant and possibly binding deal, and one that would eliminate all third-party payment as well. So, I don't know about the third-party payment piece, because that seems unlikely to me. But regardless, the fact that you have the ability to potentially tie in academic standards, the potential that you have to have potential for a buyout clause, the potential that you have the ability to potentially tie a player to the school via a contract, all these things are potentially in play. Now, do we know any of this is going to happen? No. But is the likelihood that there will be some form of a binding contract associated with some of these NIL deals going forward? It looks very probable. And that is huge, because if there's been one reluctance from a lot of boosters, and again, it is not just Florida, to get involved with some of these collectives at a high dollar level financial commitment, it has been because they do not want to pay players to come to Florida, stay a year, and walk, because of the flexibility of the transfer portal to simply leave and have no ramification for doing so whatsoever. This potentially changes that, and that is huge. Your thoughts, sir?
Hey, man, at the end of the day, you put your money where your mouth is, and you put your money on the contract on the basis of what you can do. And here's the tough part about that. The interesting thing, the key word, I think, in what you just mentioned, out of everything you said, which was spot on, believe it or not, the one thing that I keyed in on was cap.
Yep.
That's it. And I know, the kids nowadays, Gen Z, whatnot, they have a different version of cap, what that means. Not going to get into it. As I was taught by my
It's Colin Kaepernick, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. The old lone wolf. But the interesting thing is, whether it's 20 million, 21 million, whatever it works out to, it's a cap, right? And so what if schools need more? I don't think it's a matter of if. I agree with you. It's a matter of when the schools need more.
Yeah, it's
the
when, not if, for
overflow.
sure.
Yeah, the overflow comp, the bonus comp, the Schedule K1 comp. Where's that coming from? It's coming from the collectives. And so you have two ways this can go. I think it's a split road, because the first road is, if I am Mr. Big Donor over here and I own XYG Corporation, that does about $30 million a year of revenue, and I'm thinking about giving a gift or a lifetime, whatever the case might be. Before, I might have been apprehensive, right? And now I'm thinking, you know what? Not all of my funds now are going to be tied here because I've got some help. I can either I'll be more willing to give, and then Florida Victorious is nice and funded, and it looks good. It looks great. Or the other thing that can happen is, oh, guess what? The university's got 21 million to give. I'm good. I'm going to hold on to what I've got, and I'm going to, if I need to give it, I'll need to. But at the very least, these kids are getting paid. The university is going to take care of them. I'm not going to give. And so you've got two interesting roads that can come out of that because of what we discussed earlier. Great reference to pod number 21, by the way, regarding the issue of what happened. And the one that we referenced there was Ole Miss compared to Florida. Is not just the fact of people giving to the collective, is especially people are reluctant to give because of the lack of institutional control. But it's not really institutional control when it comes to the contracts, right? Because if one school institutes contracts, and if I'm a player and I'm going to that school, but I'm recruited by another school, hey, do you have a contract? No contract. Oh, great, I'm going over there. I don't want a contract. Don't tie me to anything, And so that's going to be really interesting how that comes about. But either way, I think cap is the key word. And I think that the collective still has to be flourishing in order to provide those, call them supplemental dollars, to get certain deals closed as deals change, as deals morph moving forward in the landscape of college football. Might not even be calling it college football anymore. Might be calling it, hey, they're playing for the Florida Gators LLC. Just happened to be enrolled in school there. But just saying,
you're not
when
wrong.
you look, right, when you look at everything that's happened, there's no way that you can say, okay, it just gets better from here, or we'll just tighten down the screws. No, Pandora's box is still open, still very, very much open. A lot of things are still in play. And so it's going to be either way, very, very interesting moving forward. But again, the key word I focused on was cap. And then at the end of the day, the collective still needs to be there. But then I think people can be either split two ways about it. Either the university is going to take care of the majority of it, so I'm off the hook, or yeah, you know what, the university is going to take care of the majority of it, so I feel a little bit more freely to give, since that the majority of my dollars won't be tied up with a specific player or towards a specific program.
Really interesting takes. Couple things there I hadn't considered. I assumed that if contracts were at one school, they'd be at all, but I don't know that. That's a good point. Yeah. We don't know that that's going to be a instituted rule. My assumption was, based on what we've seen, that it would be, but I don't know. Good point. My assumption was that if you had the set amount and you knew that the university was kicking in some, that you would be more inclined to kick in more, especially if there were contracts. And I think if there are contracts, then you would be. I do still think that. However, if there aren't, your point may be valid. Well, the school's already given them money, so why do I have to? Really good perspective on both of those points. At the end of the day, we don't know what's going to happen. is the moral of the story. And I think you're right there.
Well, you've got that. And the other thing I was thinking about is the fact of, again, when you look at the Power Five, because all this is based off of Power Five and TV revenue and all the money's coming in. What about the other school? And I'm not saying anything less of the WAC, the SWAC, the Mountain, the American Athletic Conference, right? Conferences like that, but they have the option to opt in. So what does that look like? Because they're definitely don't have those pool of monies from a quote unquote TV deal to go after. Yeah. No disrespect to them. And so if we're saying, let me rephrase that. If the court is saying, or if this ruling is saying, or if the NCAA is saying, if the documents are saying, or strategizing that, okay, great, $20 million cap, boom, each school has the ability to use those funds at their discretion. Well, there's another element of Wild Wild West, because then Title IX and everything else comes into play. Take University of Florida, right? What program out of all the sports programs is profitable for the University of Florida? Football. We have a baseball team that made it to the World Series last year, made it to the Final Two. Darn you, Paul Skeens and LSU, but they got eliminated today, thank goodness. We have a baseball team that's there right now fighting to get their way in after a wishy-washy season. Beautiful stadium, enjoy going to the ballpark. Barely profitable. Basketball, very profitable. We have a world-class gymnastics program, barely profitable. Right? When you look at the Capital One Cups, what do we reference the Capital One Cup to be?
You're saying barely profitable, but at the end of the day, they're not profitable. The only one that actually makes money is football. That is a fact.
Correct. Sorry.
The correct term is not profitable.
Not profitable. Correct. But that's the thing, right? Look at the Capital One Cups. Look at what the University of Florida has stood for from a student athlete standpoint, right? Look at the records. Phenomenal. But yet one sport out of 13 is profitable?
Track and field is another one.
Yes. Thank you. Track and field. So there's another disparaging metric when you look at that cap of 20 million, 21 million. Where does it go? And then what are some other ramifications of if other student athletes feel like it is being disproportionately, dispersed in not the best ways? I'll just leave it at that.
No, it's well said. It's well said. And I don't know how that works. And that's again, something that we'll have to see how that plays out and how that goes. So, or else we could end up with a nice segue to our next topic, a Jalen Rashada lawsuit. So let's move on to a Jalen Rashada lawsuit. So as you may or may not be aware, Jalen Rashada was a quarterback that was recruited by the University of Florida and reportedly, I don't know which is the right word, both maybe, offered $13.86 million in NIL compensation that we could not pay him, and therefore he walked on his originally signed NLI, not NIL, NLI. Let's not get our acronyms confused. That would be his national letter of intent that he signed on National Signing Day in 2023 and ended up going to Arizona State. He is now since transferred after this season to the University of Georgia and has now proceeded to sue not only the University of Florida and Marco, give me the name.
Marcus Castro Walker.
Yep. Marcus Castro Walker. There we go. I mixed up the Marco and the Castro. Sorry.
NCW.
There we go. But also specifically in name Billy Napier, which is very interesting. We'll get to that in a minute. He has sued them for basically what it comes down to. He sued him for fraud is the nature of the suit. But he sued him in terms of the fact that the nature of the suit is that they offered him funds that they could not pay and therefore stifled his recruitment elsewhere is really what it comes down to. That's the long and the short of it. So the questions that we have under this that we want to discuss are, does this suit have merit? And will the recent ruling or potential ruling, because again, it's not finalized, have any change or effect on the outcome of this lawsuit or not? So first things first, does it have merit? Your thoughts?
So as preposterous as it might sound, let's get to the meat and potatoes of merit, right? Is Jalen Rashada worth $13.85 million, whatever the number was? Who the hell knows, right? It's all potential.
I mean, I can tell you no, but we'll move on.
Well, sure. Okay, fine. No, emphatically, because he had a bang-up year at ASU. Sorry, just kidding. Is there merit to the lawsuit? My position is yes, for these reasons. A, there's a stated amount that he left another school for and was coming here, in theory, because of a certain dollar figure. That dollar figure that fell apart in the later stages of the deal. So if that dollar figure was not revealed, and based off the timing of it, would he have had the opportunity to pursue said funds from a similar institution, another school? Maybe. Based off of what he was able to get. Maybe he doesn't get 13.85 million.
Right.
Maybe he gets 7, maybe he gets 6. But outside of that, we know that ASU did not have the financial means to be able to do that. Based off what we read and what we heard,
Correct.
He went to ASU because of staffing and coaches and a relationship there, right?
Yep.
So that's fine. But here's the thing. If that deal did not fall apart because let's face it, people, business deals fall apart all the time, every day. But this is unique in the sense of if there was more time where the deal fell apart, if it was not up to signing day where that NLI, National Letter of Intent, had to be signed, he could have gone elsewhere to secure other funds.
Correct. He could have looked for other prospects. Yep.
Exactly. So I think that's what it boils down to. That's my take on that, B, because at the end of the day, we've all left money on the table. Let's be honest. Did he leave money on the table? Again, is he worth it? I would venture to say no. But at the end of the day, based off of a deal, based off of potential, based off all the other monies that all these other guys are calling for, he had the ability to, if this fell apart a lot sooner in December, at the end of November, depending on what happened with Miami and why he was pulled away from Miami, he would have had the opportunity to secure funds elsewhere. So that's my position on that.
So yes, and for the record, short version, I agree. I recently read an article that On3 published, and they had a rough estimation of the valuations of different positions at top tier levels.
Yeah.
And the quarterback position was valued anywhere from $750 to $1.3 million a year in NIL. That was the valuation of the position, roughly. Now, it had probably the most variance of any position and could go higher, could go lower, but somewhere in that range. So let's call it $1 million a year. Okay, just rough. And because he's a top tier guy, he was a 4-star, borderline 5-star quarterback, right? Top tier positional guy. He goes to the right school that's got the right funding in NIL. He can get $1 million a year, period. He came to Florida with the offer of a lot more than that. It was inaccurate. We didn't have it, right? And I say we, wasn't the UF that didn't have it, was whoever in the collective that promised him that didn't have it, or whoever negotiated that deal that didn't have it. And at the end of the day, that potentially cost him millions. Now he is suing for 8 figures. I'm gonna let that sink in.
Yeah.
That would be 10 million plus. And I do not see that as being a viable number for what he could have earned anywhere. Let's be clear. I do not see that as being viable. So I don't see that piece of it as having merit as far as the amount that he is suing for. However, you know how lawyers work, right? They shoot for the moon. It's normal. So having said that, do I see merit in what he is suing for from a general premise, as you said, kind of a lost wages scenario, if you will? Yes, I do. I agree with you.
Yep.
Do I think the amount is correct? Absolutely not. Was the 13.86 million correct? Absolutely not. It's laughable. we were, the NIL space was new at that time. I think people didn't really know, what was what and which way was up. And, we were all kind of scrambling and trying to figure this thing out, and mistakes were clearly made, right? Okay, it happens. Does that mean that it's okay to just make a mistake and that, that there's no harm, no foul? No, not necessarily. And again, that's why I think there are grounds. Are there 8-figure grounds? No, there are not. But again, that's neither here nor there. I won't speculate on what I think happens and whether or not I think he wins, whether or not I think they set, because that's just speculation. I don't know. And we'll get to the Napier being named piece in a minute. Second question I raised was, how does the lawsuit here, or the potential resolution to the House versus NCAA lawsuit, change or affect the outcome of this lawsuit, right? Because it changes or affects the outcome of the Colorado lawsuit for the swimmer, right? Potentially very much. So does it potentially change or affect this outcome? And the answer is potentially yes, because it could potentially provide some settlement monies to Rashada under not under the past 2021 clause, but because it was an active suit. And that is also covered by some of that back pay clause potentially, because it's not just pre-2021 it's covered by that, it's also active suits. So it's either or that are potentially included in that. So if he could then potentially get a back pay suit as part of his settlement, in terms of Florida potentially having to pay, and or the NCAA potentially having to pay some of that out from revenue dollars from TV and or, right? Because he had a suit filed, that could potentially settle this as well. I don't know if it gets there. I don't know if it makes it that far. It might settle before this even gets resolved or figured out by the judge. However, it could. The potential does exist. So that's an interesting kind of caveat as well in all this. It may not even come to that, because this suit might actually prevent it from doing so.
Yeah.
So the long story short is, we'll see. Again, I think we both agree it has merit. I think that it probably does, but I don't think it has the merit that they're trying to claim that it does. So that's the long and the short of it from my perspective. So last but not least here, how does this suit affect, or what are the implications, perhaps is a better way to ask that, on our rivalry with our good friends up in Athens? Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? So this is where I'll ask the question, how does Napier being named in this suit affect that dynamic? So let's start there. I think this is very interesting. So if this were just Rashada suing UF, or Marcus Castro Walker, who is no longer with UF, or even Hugh Hathcock, who is a great, booster of UF, but not obviously a face or a name that's commonly associated, would anybody really care that much that he's playing for Georgia and doing this because he's a backup quarterback? Would it really matter? Or would it really have an effect? I mean, maybe because he plays for UGA a little bit, or, is on the UGA team. Again, I keep saying plays. He's not going to see the field. Let's be clear on that. It's really important. He will not see the field unless Beck gets hurt, which I'm not calling for. Let's be clear. But he's not going to see the field, right? Barring injury, he will not see the field. So would anybody really care? Not really, right? It would be kind of like, oh, this punk, right? But nobody'd really care. And I'm not calling him a punk, for the record. I'm just talking about perception, right? Fan perception, things of that nature. I'm not calling him a punk, just to be clear. Because again, I think his case has merit.
Yeah.
But now you've gone and named the head coach personally in your lawsuit. Oh, buddy. Now I think you've crossed a totally different line. And for the record, I'm not sure he does have cause to do that. He claims to have a text message from Napier personally guaranteeing him NIL funds on National Signing Day. Now, I'm not going to speculate about what that text says. It has not been publicly released. Nobody's seen it. I'm thinking this is lawyers posturing, saying they have something that implies something that they really don't have, because Napier has been very confident about his statements in that he did nothing wrong. And say what you want about Napier, but he impresses me as a very high integrity person. And I don't think he's coming out saying that unless he is very confident that that is true. That is my impression of Napier. It is an opinion. I do not know that for a fact, but obviously, because I have not seen the text message, but it would be very surprising to me if he has a text that says, hey, man, hey, Jalen, we're all good. Come and sign. I can personally guarantee you that you will get $1 million if you sign today.
Right.
I would really be shocked if he has a text message that says that. Now, is there a text message that says that he knows people in that organization, and if they have told him something that he certainly feels very confident that it is something that Jalen can trust? Sure, I can see that, but that's a very different thing now, isn't it? So this is where attorneys get involved, and again, posture and, puff out their chest and, say things they want to say, right? So I don't know is the long and the short of it, right? It has not been released. I don't know. But that's why Napier is named. And by naming Napier, in my opinion, you have drastically affected this rivalry, because now you have a backup quarterback on the team that we debatably hate most of all. I don't hate him most of all, but a lot of people do. That has named our head coach in a freaking lawsuit. Are you kidding me? Whoo-wee. Oh, man, have you stoked the fire? And if we needed more reason to hate Georgia, we've got it now. So it is very interesting, the implications on this. Now, to add to that, and I'll get your thoughts on this in just a second, but to add to that, it was initially released that Kirby had somehow blessed this lawsuit. And that was like, whoa, are you kidding me? Now, as it turns out, that looks like it was much ado about nothing, because Kirby, in his comments, has come out publicly and said, basically, he did no such thing, right? He just simply said, look, that's between you and your family. You handle what you need to handle. That doesn't concern me or UGA football. That's your world. This is my world. I live in my world. You do what you need to do. It is what it is, which is, in my opinion, a completely appropriate response, right? You're not going to stop somebody from doing what they need to do. You wouldn't bar him from doing that, nor should he, right? But at the same time, you're also not saying, oh, yeah, by all means, go sue the head coach of Florida, right? No. That's not what he said. He said, hey, if that's something you need to do with you and your family, then that's something you need to do with you and your family. Just make sure you show up for practice on Monday, right? That's pretty much what he said. And there's nothing wrong with that, quite frankly. As much as I don't like Kirby, that's an appropriate comment, right? So at the end of the day, I don't have a problem with what he said there, at least not what he said publicly. So all this stuff that came out initially about him, blessing this lawsuit, I think that was at least seemingly much ado about nothing. So those are my thoughts on it. But I definitely think, because Napier was named, that there's no way this doesn't enhance that rivalry. What do you think?
That's an understatement, my friend, in more ways than 10. I'm going to ask you a question here. By chance, do you remember the number that University of Miami, the Hurricanes, pledged to Rashada?
I don't, but I believe it was something in the neighborhood of 10 mil.
That is correct, sir. 9.5.
Yeah.
So you have a 9.5
which is also ludicrous, by the way.
Yes, and this is not a State Farm commercial, so ludicrous does not appear. But anyways,
I wish he did. For the
record. Wish he did. Thank you, Luda. No. So here's the thing: Florida's offer of 13.85, which where they came up with that number, who the hell knows, right? Was in response to the 9.5 that was offered out of the dumpster fire that is Miami. And you know what? The funny thing is, I looked at that over and over. I love the dumpster fire. I love it. Sorry. I'm sorry. I had to. Most 8-yard, 6-yard, 8-yard, 10-yard dumpsters are green. It might be Miami Hurricane green, but
Circle your calendars, everybody. August 31st. Let's go.
There you go. Let's go. But here's the thing. After everything I read about that deal, the consensus was that Rashada's camp was already known in the recruiting circles for being greedy, for being money hungry, and just having their hands out.
Yep.
Okay. So here's the thing. Okay, 9.5. Hey, kid, here's 13.85, whatever. 13.85 based off of the trail that we followed. Out of that was supposed to come $500,000. $500,000 was supposed to come and be wired. Boom. Hey, get your brokerage account set up. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, that didn't come. Hey, where's the money? Hey, not sure. Hey, we've got some people working on it. I agree. Not a personal guarantee. I don't think he's that silly. I'll just say silly. But that's the thing, right? Then $500,000 turned into, hey, we've got resources. We've got people working on it. Who are the people, right? At the time, MCW, right? So you got Castro Walker working on it. You've got Hugh Hathcock working on it.
Hugh Hathcock, baby.
Right? And here's the thing. Hugh Hathcock, based off my memory, just last fall, the fall before, maybe it was 22, was inducted. You know, he's been a Bull Gator for years, but had the single biggest gift in UF history. It was a massive gift amount. You know, they brought him down to the field for that game.
Was it 13.86 million?
I want to say it was.
I had to.
I want to say it was somewhere in the vicinity of about 12 million, maybe around 12 million change. Don't quote me on that. But it was the largest.
Shouldn't have left Rashada. He was good for it. Billy told you he was.
Yeah, right. It was the largest amount.
I'm kidding. Don't quote me. I'm kidding.
I know you are. But it was the largest amount by any Gator booster ever, and it was phenomenal. So Hugh's got his thing. He's got, Velocity, automotive group. So and that's all great. But here's the thing, though. Regardless of what happened or didn't happen, I get the lost wages, 100%, 10 mil, 13.85. Whew, in your dreams, cowboy. Okay. So you go out to ASU, you're still a perennial 4-star, borderline 5-star. And what do? You're 6'4". Now, the one issue that I had with him, besides the money hungry part, 6'4", $175. Kind of like a Jaden Daniels, kinda, maybe, sorta, but need a little bit of meat on the bones. On that basis, only started 2 games for ASU last season.
I was gonna say you can't run like Jaden Daniels.
No, not aggravated, not had a knee injury, re-aggravated a knee injury. Didn't play until the end of the season. Final numbers: 485 yards, 53% passing, 4 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Rushed 14 times for 23 yards. I get it. It's ASU. But at the same time, when you look at a player of that caliber, okay, it's ASU. You should be able to come on the field and make immediate impact. Your impact should be felt. I don't think he can be that impact player. Therefore, again, to your question, does it have merit? Sure, but the dollar amount, way, way, way off. Here's the other thing. If you want to go ahead and pursue a lawsuit for the University of Florida, the collective, which by the way, as we talked about, the original collective it was not Florida Victorious, right? The Gator Collective, right? That was run by Hugh Hathcock. And then you had, of course, Marcus Castro Walker, right? He was the director of the collective group. He was the one who was dismissed. So regardless if some of those text messages came from MCW, whatever the case might be, at the end of the day, to pursue a lawsuit, fine, no problem. Pursue the lawsuit. But to directly name Coach Napier, you just crossed the proverbial line. Now it's personal. Now it's severely personal. To go back to your comment on Kirby, I'll try and do my best Kirby here. Kirby was quoted as saying at SEC Media Days, "Say what you want, do what you will. He told me the day before they decided to do the lawsuit, and I told him that he would be between his family, and his attorneys. I'm not involved in it. George's not involved in it in any way. Jaden's a good football player. We knew Jade when he was coming out. He got a good body of work. He's had the ability to play. He's really critical at the quarterback position. He's actually played it. He's very talented, and we're just happy he's joining us. Looking forward to working with him moving forward." That's what Kirby said. All right.
I need to insert the applause here. That was really good. That was a nice Kirby. I like it.
Oh, thanks. You're welcome. Appreciate that. And so outside of that, blessing, no blessing, fine. But you want to direct it to a program, you want to direct it to a collective, that's right. But when you direct it to an individual player such as Napier, and again, maybe we're seeing things with orange and blue goggles, as we've mentioned before, but everything about Billy Napier. I'll tell you what, did you see the comments about Brian Harsin towards Napier?
No, I did not.
Brian Harsin, former Auburn coach, didn't last that long.
Oh, yes. Actually, I take that back. I did see that article.
Yeah, right? I mean, listen, he's a guy, Sunbelt Billy, whatever you want to call it, but he's always been touted as trying to do things the right way.
Yep.
Is it semantics? Is it just a chess match right now? That's why they're not releasing the document or the text or the paper or a picture of the text that shows what he was promised. No, they're going to go through this rigmarole. It's going to take time. It's going to take energy. It's going to take effort. And guess what? I don't believe we needed any more fuel to add to the fire for that game. But guess what? More fuel in a massive way was just dumped on the Flames. And now I anticipate multiple brawls to occur before that game. And I occur some Noshan Moreno-like hits to go down in that game. And my only anticipation is that we are the one delivering the blows, period.
So let me give you a scenario.
Yeah.
Fast forward a year and change from now, about a year and a half from now, actually, a little less than that. Late October, early November 2025.
Oh.
Carson Beck has been drafted in the NFL. Some are projecting #1 overall, by the way, which is laughable to me, but whatever. And it's not to say that I don't think Carson Beck's a decent quarterback, but he's not a #1 overall NFL draft pick in my book. But that's a whole nother thing. The NFL has a tendency to evaluate talent interestingly, and we'll leave it at that. I'm not getting into that conversation. And the starting quarterback in the Florida-Georgia game in Jacksonville is Jalen Rashada. How do you think that game goes?
First of all, interesting scenario. A lot of fuel, a lot of fire. Now it's year 4. Now it's literally put up or shut up, and to the point where you're going after an SEC East title. However,
and let me add one more element. Sorry to cut you off. I forgot this. Let's assume that Florida's defense has improved, because I speculate they very much will this year. And let's assume that continues a year beyond this year, right? So we have 2 years now of that improvement going into that. Ooh-wee. I don't know that I want to be Jalen Rashada in that game, buddy.
Hey, I'll tell you what. A, I hope he can run, but B, my other point was going to be, I don't think he's going to be at Georgia come fall of 25.
And he may not. You very well may be right about that. We'll see what happens, but you very well may be right. He might be one of these kids that's just going to transfer for the BBD, right? The bigger, better deal.
Right. Because that's the other thing too. He also, besides the knee injury, allegedly he also had thumb surgery as well. So he's also trying to recover from the thumb surgery. So who knows?
He also might not be the starter. That's the other angle, right?
Yeah.
So there's quite a few things that are potentially in play there. So I don't know what happens, but anyway, just interesting scenarios to consider. So
and don't forget Gunnar Stockton, right? That's Beck's backup. Gunnar Stockton is
that's true.
Beck's backup. He's been solidified in that lineup. So Rashada's coming in not even as a backup. Rashada came in based off of what I read, and I could be wrong, right? Sharing the third team snaps with a freshman guy by the name of Ryan Puglisi. Apologize on the pronunciation.
Yeah.
So really,
you're right. You're right.
Come on, what are we doing? Is it one of those things where Kirby just said, "Hey, come on down here. We got we got a former Gator, another former Gator. We're just it's gonna be University of Florida North all of a sudden. We got University of Florida West, University of Florida North." So either way, I'm sorry. I digress.
No, it's good. It's good. It's a good point too, because you're right. It very possibly could be Gunnar rather than him that is starting. I didn't even think about that, but you're right. And you're also right that he very well could transfer again, because he very well might. So anyway, it's just interesting. But I do think again, the key piece of this to me is naming Napier. I think if there's something that's going to add fuel to the fire here, that's going to be the piece that does it, regardless of how this thing turns out. Just the
100%.
fact that he had the gall, frankly, to do that, regardless of the situation. Why was that necessary? Why was that needed? Why did you need to do that? I don't think you did, for the record. Why did you need to throw that on there to, help your case? It was a fractional sum of money, potentially, in terms of what you were overall suing for, right? Based on what he supposedly guaranteed. So why did
Right.
you need to do it? The whole thing doesn't really make sense to me. It feels personal. It feels like a money grab. It feels like all of these things, or a try at a money grab, which, again, I won't speculate on what happens, but it
Yeah.
just doesn't feel necessary. And to your point, I think it is definitely something that is going to stoke that flame. Again, we don't know. Players obviously can't comment on it, so we don't know how they feel. We can't speculate on that. I'd love to, but I can't. But I'd be very interested to see what happens, and will be very interested to see what happens come that game this year. Because I'd be surprised if there's not, as you said, some tensions flaring up beforehand, more so than usual. But time will tell, and we'll see. So,
Yep.
on that note, I think that closes us up here. Any other thoughts you want to mention about NIL as a whole here, or anything else we've discussed other than, it's been, an hour that we've talked about on this pod, so it's probably changed 9 times. But aside from that, anything else you want to comment on?
That's all. Yeah. No, man. It's just amazing, to have a landmark case like that, and a ruling that's going to take, a few months to iron out. We see this thing, and I'll just call it compensation to student athletes, continue to morph, and it's very much a fluid situation. There's no way in Sam Hill that anyone can tell me, yep, this is case law, this is precedent, we're good to go. It is far from over, and it's really going to be interesting to see how this terrain plays out, not just over the next couple of years, but dating out for that decade time frame, as we look at some of the other things that come into play regarding paying the players, the student athletes, getting them maybe on payroll, W-2 compensation, all these other rules that come into play. And then, of course, there's the TV dollars, there's the endorsement deals, and all the other dollars surrounding the thing known as college sports. But of course, more specifically, the big draw, college football.
Yeah, and I think the thing that comes out of it for me, and the interesting thing for me, is we have a proposal here, one way or another, however it shakes out, right? The W-2s, the antitrust, the Title IXs, whatever. We have a proposal in place, agreed upon by both sides, the players, right, or the lawyers for the players that are fighting these lawsuits, and the NCAA, to have a structure in place to pay them some of the revenue dollars from the universities, which had not yet been in play, and which we had called for to get in play, right? Because it made sense to be a part of this. Mm-hmm. So regardless of how all this stuff shakes out, is my point. We have a proposal in place that I think in some shape, manner, or form will be approved. I'd be shocked if some version of this didn't get approved, where the players are going to be paid a piece of the revenue that the schools are earning, which is really what this should have been about with NIL from the beginning. Let's get real.
Yep.
Right. It's been, the NCAA tried to roadblock it. Let's get real. That was futile. Right. It was just a matter of time. And now we've gotten to a place where that's no longer the case. Now, whether or not this 22% thing is what sticks, or whether or not, again, whatever. The point is, some of that revenue sharing is now going to be passed along to the players, as it should be. And that, I think, is what's landmark about this. And I think, honestly, what's good about this, because I think if we can get to a place where that's a universal constant across at least the Power 4, we've been saying Power 5, I wonder how long it's going to take for us to transition to Power 4 as being our primary vocabulary on this. But for the Power 4 at a minimum, I think where that is now the rule, right, going forward after next year, I think that's probably a better place actually for NIL, right? If NIL is going to exist, which it is, right? The cat's out of the bag. Pandora's box has been open, as we've said a million times. This is a better way for it to exist in some shape, form, or fashion, certainly than what currently exists, or than some other, bizarre off the wall proposal. They should get a piece of revenue share of revenue, or they should get a share of revenue. Sorry, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yep.
That's how this should work. Period. It's simple. That's how it works in the NFL. That's how it works in any professional sport. I understand this isn't technically a professional sport, but if you're giving them access to revenue as part of their play, then they should get revenue sharing. Whatever you want to call it, there should be revenue sharing involved if they're going to have access to revenue for their play, one way or another. However we're going to define them, however we're going to classify them, employees or not, which again, eventually I think we get there too, but I digress. At the end of the day, revenue sharing has to be a piece of that. And I'm really glad that we've gotten to a point where that's there, because that's so much easier to regulate. And that's the message here, I think, in the long run. And what I think is actually really beneficial about all this, and really good, not only for this thing called NIL as a whole, but also, again, as we talked about, for UF, because they are in a great position, being in the SEC, to be able to facilitate this for the athletes, for the football players specifically, as we care about, right? And on this pod, and to be able to continue to work to build a roster and a team that is ideally at the highest level going forward, and compete at that highest level in years to come.
Yeah.
So that's all I got.
Well said. Way to close it out.
Thank you.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll go ahead and sum it up. But Gator Nation, we appreciate y'all for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this one. This, good bit of labor went into this one. Not as much research involved as last two pods, but either way, still a decent amount. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much. So wherever you are, wherever you may be listening, thanks for taking the time, and we will see you around, Gator Nation.